guiding Canada through one of its most difficult periods of time, giving voting rights to women, and leading the Canadian delegation at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. He's a man who undoubtedly shaped the future of Canada forever. Introducing Sir Robert Laird Borden. Robert Borden was born on the 26th of June, 1854, later to become a prominent Canadian lawyer and politician. In 1901, he succeeded Sir Charles Tupper as the leader of the Canadian Conservative Party. Beginning his career as a staunch imperialist, he began to rebuild the party and created the Halifax Platform, described by Borden as the most advanced and progressive policy ever put forward in federal affairs. It promised a more selective immigration policy, national regulation of telegraphs, telephones, and railways, and a reform of the Senate and the civil service. He often criticized Liberal leader Sir Wilfrid Laurier for his policies concerning Britain and went head-on against him in the 1908 federal election, with Borden's Conservatives ultimately losing. However, in the 1911 federal election, Borden led a successful campaign with their opposition of a reciprocity agreement with the Americans. Once in power, Borden slowly began to see the necessity of an independent position for Canada within the British Empire. On the 28th of July 1914, a bloody war broke out in Europe. This became known as the Great War, and later the First World War, with over 9 million combatants killed in a 4-year period. As the Canadian Prime Minister, he had the job of orchestrating Canada's massive contribution to the war effort on the side of Britain, as well as managing increasing political problems and social tensions back at home. Borden quickly realized the nature of the sudden crisis and passed the War Measures Act on August 22, 1914, effectively transforming the Canadian government into a wartime administration. This meant that Canada would not only recruit an army for the sake of the war effort, but the entire country would undergo a systemic reorganization in order to raise funds, safeguard the currency, obtain manpower and equipment, and to regulate agriculture, transportation, and industry. In 1915, Borden visited Canadian soldiers at the front lines in France and in hospitals in Britain, appalled at what he saw. He was also shocked by the apparent incompetence of the British administration and demanded that Canada be granted more power in military decisions. Borden became convinced that Canadians must dedicate every last effort to their forces in Europe for the sake of an Allied victory. In February 1916, the centre block of Parliament burned. Borden escaped, but his office and the contents within were destroyed by the fire. The cause was apparently accidental, though a widespread rumor said it was enemy sabotage. Even with this, Borden continued on. He made the decision to invoke mandatory military service, which later nearly tore the country apart. It bitterly divided the nation between the English Canadians supporting the idea and the French Canadians, who no longer had any particular loyalty to either the British or the French. Borden decided to create a coalition government to implement conscription, made up of liberals and conservatives, and made the issue a test of loyalty to the country to lure liberals into his union. Now, the female suffragists were people who supported the right for both men and women to vote, and gained momentum later on in the war as women began to take up more jobs, with men leaving for the battlefield. The lack of balance between women's contributions and their rights became increasingly apparent. The Military Voters Act in August 1917 improved Borden's chances in the next election by giving the vote to likely conscription supporters. It gave voting rights to all Canadian soldiers regardless of their period of residence, and it also benefited the women's suffrage movement by giving the vote to women who were in the military as combatants or nurses. The Wartime Elections Act in September extended the vote to any women over 21 who were closely related to anyone serving or had served in the military. Although these pieces of legislation were blatant attempts by Borden to gain more votes, they were great leaps forward for the acceptance of women's rights. The Conservative Union government won the 1917 fall election amidst fierce accusations, and believed in a large, effective military and maximum industrial and agricultural mobilization for the war. It only had 3 Quebec members, and therefore Quebec was almost without representation in the government. The Military Service Act was officially enacted and led to the Conscription Crisis of 1917. With this, Borden had ignited controversies over English-French relations and the power of the federal government in the lives of Canadians, which both still rage on today. On the 11th of November 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice, effectively resulting in a victory for the Allied forces. Borden had committed over 600,000 troops to the war effort, with approximately 50,000 killed and 173,000 wounded. Canada was utterly exhausted, with a total population of less than 8 million over the duration of the war, but the sacrifices were not fruitless. Canada was a distinguished nation on the battlefields of Europe, with Canadian troops proving themselves to be some of the most elite soldiers while fighting at the Somme, Ypres, and especially at Vimy Ridge. At the 1919 Paris Peace Conference to set peace terms following the war, Borden demanded that Canada be given its own seat, separate from Britain. The British opposed this, wanting to maintain more control over Canada, while the Americans saw this as an extra British vote. Borden put emphasis on the fact that Canada lost a much larger proportion of its men than the US, and all that suffering meant that Canada at least deserved representations of minor power. Through Borden's persistence, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the Americans eventually accepted the idea and allowed separate delegations for several nations of the British Empire. In addition to representing Canada as a nation, he played a major role in allowing each dominion to sign the Treaty of Versailles as its own sovereign state and maintain an independent League of Nations membership. His efforts at the Paris Peace Conference and participation in the establishment of the League of Nations really contributed towards Canada's growing independence from the British Empire, and his presence as an autonomous voice in international affairs. Unfortunately, the exhaustion from years of relentless work and effort caught up to Borden, and in 1920 he retired as Prime Minister for health concerns. He would represent Canada for the last time while signing the resulting Arms Reduction Treaty at the Washington Naval Conference in 1922. Without the efforts of Sir Robert Laird Borden, Canada would not be what it is today. He led our country through the entirety of the First World War to greatly assist the Allies in achieving a victory. He was the first in Canada to begin giving voting rights to women, and now Canada is one of the top countries in terms of gender equality. Finally, Borden laid the foundation for Canadian independence on a national and international scale through his passion and persistence at the Paris Peace Conference. You can now find Borden on the $100 bill, as well as a statue at Parliament Hill. That rhymed, by the way. Thank you for your time.